Do you remember when Super Mario Bros. Wonder was first revealed through a meaty 2-minute trailer that showed all sorts of interesting stuff, and yet basically the only thing most people talked about for the following weeks was the elephant transformation that was shown off at the end? I remember the internet going crazy over the potential of this power-up, its wacky design, how it might work for other players, and of course its potential abilities. And yet now, close to 3 years after the game's reveal, not only has the strangeness of this design mostly worn off for me, but I feel like it's become clear that the elephant fruit, or whatever you want to call it, maybe hasn't turned out to be as noteworthy of an addition to Mario's power-up catalog as many people expected it to be. And recently I've been wondering why. Hello everyone, today I want to discuss what makes a good Mario power-up, and why I think the elephant transformation has ended up being kind of underwhelming. Now before we get into things, you may have already noticed how I've been referring to this thing as the elephant transformation, which is not only a bit of a mouthful, but also doesn't fall in line with most other Mario power-ups, which are typically referred to as suits. However, of course, the weird thing about this power-up, and what partially made it so noteworthy when it was first revealed, is that the players' bodies completely transform, whilst their outfits stay the same, instead of the other way around. So even though this is all just a massive nitpick, and I've made the mistake before myself, calling it a suit isn't strictly accurate. Anyways, so what makes a good Mario power-up? I think all of Mario's abilities can broadly be described using 3 attributes. Their offensive capabilities, so usually how they help the player deal with enemies more easily, their expanded moveset, like how a lot of power-ups allow the player to fly to some extent, and in some cases their drawbacks, since quite a few power-ups limit the player in a way that makes using them more like a trade-off than an all-round improvement. The prototypical Mario power-up, the Fire Flower, exclusively has offensive capabilities, but most others fall within multiple categories. Take Yoshi for example. His tongue allows you to gobble up enemies and potentially spit them back out for even more offensive power. Even before he was able to flutter jump, riding Yoshi allowed you to bounce on spiky enemies and obstacles, thus expanding the player's moveset, but he also prevents the player from being able to perform some more advanced default moves like spin jumping, ground pounding, and wall jumping. In some power-ups, the drawbacks arguably outweigh the additional abilities, which is why, for example, New Super Mario Bros.'s Mini Mushroom and Blue Shell are pretty divisive. But in most cases, the developers either managed to find a pretty even balance between the ups and downs of power-ups, or simply didn't include any downsides whatsoever. For example, ostensibly the penguin suit doesn't have any drawbacks. It greatly expands both the player's combat and movement capabilities without sacrificing anything. Now I could argue that the penguin's underwater movement is sometimes more annoying than it is useful, and the same is also the case for the penguin slide ability. But I don't think these are downsides that the developers specifically intended as a part of the power-up's design, but just the result of personal preferences. And in case this wasn't clear, obviously that is what a lot of this comes down to: personal preference. Although power-ups can be categorized in a reasonably definitive way, they can't be ranked objectively because so much of what makes a Mario power-up good comes down to what any given person is looking for in a power-up. Like, in my opinion, it's kind of a bad thing that the Super Leaf and Cape Feather allow any player with a bit of skill to fly over entire level segments, not to mention that these power-ups don't have any obvious drawbacks whatsoever. But I know a lot of people who love that about these abilities, and dislike the way that, for example, the Tanuki suit has been nerfed in more recent appearances. Anyways, getting back to the question at hand, the point I'm trying to make isn't necessarily that good Mario power-ups have to feature a balance between attributes that help and hinder the player. Plenty of power-ups I really like are only ever beneficial, such as the Acorn suit or the Cloud Flower. And sometimes an ability's drawbacks feel so arbitrary that I'd rather they weren't included at all. Like, why does the Bee suit stop you from being able to side flip and wall jump? No, instead what I think makes a good Mario power-up is the inclusion of one or several multifaceted abilities that feel cohesive in a way that emphasizes a single unique overarching gimmick. Now, that is once again quite a mouthful, so let me break it down for you by discussing my favorite Mario power-up, the Super Bell. Mario's catsuit really only has two main features, a simple scratch attack and the ability to climb walls. And yet these are so interconnected and so useful that the Super Bell feels like it allows for a dozen different moves depending on the context. The movement of the scratch attack changes completely depending on if you're standing still, running, or in mid-air. And not only is the wall climb ability applicable to a surprising variety of surfaces, but it's also easy to go from mid-air cat bounces to wall climbing in ways that expand the overall moveset of the power-up even further. On top of these major abilities, the catsuit also changes the player's interaction with the world in more subtle ways, such as the fact that you accelerate faster and have a hitbox that's permanently one block tall. And apart from the fact that they mean the power-up is just really fun and useful, what I like about the Super Bell's seemingly random abilities from a broader perspective is how they are all actually extremely cohesive. You're a cat, you have claws so you can attack with them and climb walls, and you run on all fours so you have a lower profile and accelerate more quickly. And all of these abilities help to give the power-up an overarching feeling of agility and speed that seems very intentional. And it's clear that this level of thought was put into even some of the simpler power-ups. The Fire Flower could have just been a thoughtless projectile ability that allowed the player to snipe enemies from afar, but instead the way its fireballs are shot diagonally and bounce across the ground encourages players to fire mid-jump or up close to an enemy, which leads to more engaging gameplay. The Super Leaf gives the player a tail attack that again encourages players to get up close to enemies, and although its flying capability is occasionally overpowered, this can only be achieved by making very careful use of the level terrain. These power-ups may not have as clear of an overarching central idea as the Super Bell, but they nonetheless feel thought out in ways that some other power-ups simply don't. And speaking of which, that finally brings us back around to the elephant transformation. Because if, in my opinion, the Super Bell is the gold standard of Mario power-up design, how does the elephant fruit fail to live up to that? On the surface, the abilities are actually quite similar. Just like the catsuit, the elephant transformation doesn't so much have a single defining move as a range of less significant abilities that together make up a single power-up. In another sense, the power-ups are basically opposites, since whereas the catsuit is all about speed and agility, the elephant transformation's overarching gimmick is its lumbering brute force strength. Being an elephant allows the player to perform a trunk swipe attack that's much like a Tanuki tail attack but with a broader reach, store water in their trunk that can be sprayed to affect specific gimmicks, run across 2 block wide gaps, move pushable elements more easily, defeat multi-hit enemies more quickly, break brick blocks from below without losing momentum, hit multi-coin blocks all at once, and carry big shells. So with all of these somewhat cohesive attributes, how come the overall package feels kind of underwhelming? I think this comes down to 3 main problems. First of all, the elephant transformation doesn't have a single unique defining ability that makes it easy to distinguish or fits with the elephant aesthetic. Its central gimmick is the trunk attack, I suppose, but this is basically just a slightly more powerful version of the same kind of basic melee attack that loads of Mario power-ups come with. And whereas that is usually a side gimmick for those power-ups, for the elephant transformation, this is it. So the trunk attack isn't unique and could have worked regardless of the elephant design, and apart from that, all of the power-ups abilities are related to the player's increased size and weight. Of course, that in and of itself is a byproduct of the elephant look, but that being the main takeaway from this crazy design is a big missed opportunity in my opinion. Remember how when the elephant fruit was first shown off, some people thought other players might transform into different animals? At the time I thought that was a really unlikely idea, because assuming the power-up would still function the same for every player despite the different designs, surely the elephant's abilities would only make sense for an elephant and wouldn't just be applicable to any other animal. But with how basic the moveset ended up being, sure, I suppose this idea actually could have worked, and I think that's a bad sign. Now, you may have noticed how I didn't mention the water spraying ability throughout all that, but that actually ties into the second problem I have with this power-up, which is how it was seemingly purposely made to only be useful in some levels. It's pretty normal for Mario games to feature some power-ups that are very context-dependent. The frog and penguin suits are the obvious examples, but this is almost never the case for a game's main ability. Not only is the elephant transformation only good for mowing through blocks and enemies, meaning it is often quite useless in more platforming-focused levels, but these stupid dry bud things, their functionality drives me crazy. I don't like it when collectibles in Mario levels are locked behind power-up abilities without any easy alternative. It just often forces the player to have to replay the levels, and is also usually an excuse to not have to come up with more interesting, accessible secrets. And Super Mario Bros. Wonder is filled to the brim with this exact thing because of these dried out buds, which more often than not can only be activated using the elephant's water spray ability. There are a few instances where this actually facilitates a larger, more interesting puzzle setup, but most of the time this is just a lazy way of squeezing some replay value out of random levels by making them reward the player by coming back to them with the elephant transformation. Which is even more frustrating because other levels basically unintentionally punish the player for using the ability, since it can be quite annoying to squeeze through tight sections that clearly weren't necessarily designed with the elephant's larger hitbox in mind. Anyways, my final problem with this power-up is a pretty big and obvious one, which is that I don't think it's that fun or interesting to use. Think about how the cat, acorn, or even tanuki suit kinda changes how the game feels and how you play through levels. It's fun and unique to climb up walls or glide through the air, and compared to that, the elephant transformation simply doesn't stack up. I actually quite like how Wonder doesn't feature any traditional flying power-ups, so I'm not saying that should have been an elephant feature, but something, anything to shake up the gameplay when you're using this thing more than just being able to destroy enemies and blocks more easily would have gone a long way. In many ways, the elephant transformation is less of a gimmicky suit type power-up and more like a second tier version of the super mushroom. It makes the player bigger and changes their interaction with enemies and blocks in certain subtle ways, and that's basically it. And viewed in that light, I think the power-up's inclusion isn't really that bad or anything, it just doesn't serve the kind of role that power-ups that Mario games are marketed around typically fulfill. As much as I can try to dissect my problems with this transformation in a semi-objective game design way, what it really comes down to is something very subjective. The promise of the way the elephant fruit was revealed and marketed versus the way it ended up being just another power-up in-game probably does account for the bulk of the disappointment I feel about the ability. And that being said, obviously its lackluster implementation didn't ruin the game for me or anything. Between this and the Wonder Effect criticism video I made a few weeks ago, it might seem like I feel very divided about the game despite it being such a huge part of my channel, but that definitely isn't the case. Super Mario Bros. Wonder is one of my favorite Mario games, but also one of the ones I've played the most of, meaning I have a lot of random niche little problems with it that only somewhat affect my overall feelings towards the game in the grand scheme of things. And for what it's worth, whereas I clearly don't particularly like the game's elephant power-up, the bubble flower and drill suit are both excellent additions. Being able to shoot bubbles that can both defeat enemies and be jumped on is such a brilliantly simple ability that it's no wonder modders came up with it years ago. And although the drill suit's usability is definitely more limited, it is nonetheless a pretty elegant and cohesive power-up that works really well in the levels that are designed around it. So 2 out of 3 isn't that bad. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about for today. If you have any strong feelings about Mario power-ups, or maybe some suggestions for how the elephant transformation could have been improved, maybe let me know by leaving a comment. While you're down there, please also consider leaving a like, or subscribing, or checking out my Discord server linked in the description, or becoming a channel member to get early access to my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!